First laws in the city of Seattle that were created were, number one, Indian people could not own property.
Generations outlawed from owning land. Communities of color fighting to take it back.
How can you have equity without land?
We've learned the land given to one tribe here in Washington is literally making them sick.
What do you think is the core issue here that allows something like this to happen?
Racism.
It's the American dream, owning a home or property, something you can call your own, to build equity, use for your retirement, or pass on to your kids. You may think it's hard to buy a home, these days especially because it's so expensive. But for Asians, Blacks, and Native Americans, it often wasn't just impossible, it was illegal. Yes, literally illegal. Welcome to Facing Race. I'm Joyce Taylor, and tonight we begin with a look at what it was like for people of color here in Washington not so long ago. Data from the University of Washington found from the 1910s to the 1960s, whites put restrictions on land ownership across the Puget Sound region. Those restrictions were written right into property deeds. This is Southeast Seattle. Today, this part of the city has the highest population of Asians and Blacks. These three examples date back to 1928. In Squire Park, near Seattle's Central District, properties could not be sold, leased, or rented to a Black person. In Jefferson Park, people of color could only live on a property if they were domestic servants. In the southwest part of the city, one restriction was very specific. Beverly Park said any Hebrew or any person of the Ethiopian, Malay, or Asiatic race could not live in homes there. So now let's look at the people who were here first, the people who called this place home long before white settlers even thought of calling it the state of Washington. Tribes that controlled land across the Pacific Northwest signed treaties with the U.S. government between 1854 and 1856. That's when their territory dramatically shrank. Those treaties promised they could keep some of their land and their rights would be protected. But we all know by now the government broke a lot of those promises. Ted Land tells us about a fight for recognition and respect that's gone on now for 165 years.
We should acknowledge that we are here on Duwamish lands. And every time we acknowledge how our city grows,
we must realize that all of that growth came at the expense of the first Indigenous people.
City leaders often use that script as a prelude to gatherings and events. They pause and then move on with the show. For many Duwamish people, including James Rasmussen, it's not enough.
That's not helping us at all. I mean, it really doesn't do anything for us at all. An acknowledgement, you know what, it's like telling a ghost story. I'm sorry, we're beyond that.
Talk is cheap.
Exactly.
His ancestors fished the Duwamish River for generations and lived along its banks. The story of what happened to them after white settlers moved in is motivation for Rasmussen to keep advocating for his people.
It's my ancestors walk with me. They're here. My family is here. I know that.
The wrongs started shortly after the Duwamish made what they thought was a deal with the American settlers who were moving west. The Duwamish leader, Chief South, or Seattle, signed a treaty with the U.S. government in 1855, giving up thousands of acres of land, which today includes much of King County. In exchange, the U.S. was supposed to guarantee the Duwamish hunting and fishing rights, as well as land on a reservation. Not long after the ink dried, white settlers blocked the formation of a Duwamish reservation. While Seattle boomed, city leaders told the Duwamish, get out of the way.
First laws in the city of Seattle that were created were, number one, Indian people could not own property. That's racism. After sunset, you better not be in the city, or else you'll be arrested.
For being an Indian,
For just being an Indian.
People settled Seattle in order to make it an industrial world-class city. That was, explicitly the intent from the beginning.
Doesn't matter who was here first.
It absolutely did not matter who was here first.
B.J. Cummings wrote The River That Made Seattle, which chronicles the city's fraught history.
Colonial occupation requires, by its nature, a willingness and even enthusiasm for subjugating people who are already there. That's not possible unless you consider them lesser than yourself, or unless you consider yourself more powerful than them.
My grandfather always told me, you are Duwamish. Be proud of that. The other thing he would tell you, don't tell a lot of other people, because when he was raised and my mother was raised, they were berated because they were Indian people.
Injustice echoes today. The federal government still does not recognize the Duwamish as a tribe, which denies them funding for housing, education, and health care. The government argues, in part, that the Duwamish, who number roughly 600, lack a, quote, distinct American Indian community.
We signed the treaty. You know, what's happening now is an abomination of law.
The fact that as a colonial government, we refuse to even recognize that they are still here is perhaps the deepest of the cuts. Duwamish people invited, recruited, supported, and ultimately sided, really, with the settlers here. And today we deny their existence.
But a growing number of people are waking up, realizing that doing right by the Duwamish
We should acknowledge that we are here on Duwamish lands.
is about more than simply repeating kind words.
We must realize that all of that growth came at the expense of the first Indigenous people.
For example, there's a fundraising effort called Real Rent, where anyone can voluntarily pay a kind of rent into a fund that goes to the Duwamish. The idea being, we're on their land, let's pay them for it. Donors choose how much to give each month, and the money goes to a nonprofit that supports tribe members.
We are offering scholarships now to Duwamish kids to be able to go to school.
The Duwamish continue to push for federal recognition. It's a long, tiring pursuit, but Seattle's first people persevere.
We're getting stronger.
You keep fighting.
Yes. Yeah. The spirits of my ancestors is why I do this, and for the generations to come ahead.
The Duwamish and other tribes lost a lot of their land. As painful as that is, what's even worse is that today, a lot of the land designated for tribes comes with a host of issues. And that brings us to another kind of injustice we often don't talk about. Michael Crow takes us to Eastern Washington to show us environmental racism.
This is home for the Spokane tribe, their reservation in eastern Washington, northwest of the city of Spokane. Tucked in the Selkirk Mountains, the tribe has lived on this land since the reservation was established in 1881 and in the area long before. But these forests are also home to something else.
There's just a feeling, it's just, I get sick to my stomach.
Rich deposits of uranium. In the atomic sprint of the Cold War, some of the raw material came from here, the Midnight Mine. When it closed in 1981, it left a massive pit and a slew of environmental problems, toxins leaching into the groundwater, spreading into the soil, and a risk of human exposure to these contaminants.
You know, they found it on Indian lands, and it was opened up for companies to come in and pay minimal for the resources.
4 decades later, and tribal member Twala Abrahamson Swan is still working to get the reservation cleaned up. And her fight is not just against dangerous pollution, but also a larger issue, environmental racism.
My name is Isabel Carreras Amanillo. I work at University of Washington in the College of the Environment as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program Specialist.
She teaches a course on race and the environment exploring this issue.
Environmental racism was a concept that started being used in the United States between the 70s and 80s to denote those disproportionate impact on communities of color.
With the valuable natural resource of uranium on the reservation, this is a textbook case of environmental racism. First, the government moved the tribe to this land as white settlers expanded across the U.S.
When allotments were being made, our people were pushed to the mountain areas because at that time, a lot of the farmlands were more desirable.
But that rare uranium brought the government back. This is where the Midnight Mill stood at the edge of the reservation. The reminders today are everywhere. The mine area is so contaminated, it's an EPA Superfund cleanup site. The federal agency sued the owners, Newmont Mining, to bring them back and clean it up. But the process will take years.
Because it's contamination that you really can't see or smell, so they could be going generations and generations drinking the water, breathing contaminated air and not know it.
It strikes me, I look out at this and it's this incredible, beautiful landscape, but you know from studies and from these signs, right, like that this has been poisoned, basically.
I think it's a delicate balance between, too much fear in the impacts that people may get from eating the fish or eating the wildlife. We really don't want to discourage people away from that because ultimately that's the healthiest thing for them and their families. But our wildlife are impacted, our fish are impacted.
And people, too. The tribe says there is a cluster of rare health problems among their members.
We had a span of about 3 months and we lost 10 tribal members to cancer during that time. And it was an eye-opener.
The impacts of environmental racism reach well beyond the Spokane tribe. A 2015 paper in the journal Geosciences notes, the legacy of uranium procurement has left a legacy of long-lived health effects for many Native Americans and Alaska Natives in the United States. It's been a major issue for the Navajo people as well, with over 500 abandoned uranium mines on their land.
The Midnight Mine is upstream and drains into Blue Creek here, which drains into the Spokane River and then into the Columbia River.
And here on the reservation near Blue Creek, they worry about what's happening from the laundry list of toxic chemicals found in the water, air, and soil, and in the plants and animals that can't read these signs.
So in combination, what do all of these as a mixture do to the human body? And it's not studied.
Not to put too fine a point on it, but it sounds like at some level, this place is killing people.
Yes.
That must be hard to sit with.
It's hard to sit with. I think we had a good day.
But for Twala, the fallout of environmental racism is extremely real and especially painful.
I was diagnosed with leiomyosarcoma cancer in 2016. For me, it's associated with that mine site.
This is her mother, Deb Abrahamson. Her cancer is terminal.
It angers me. It angers me that I'm in this situation.
We just immediately focused on just our own, spending time with each other, continuing to go to the mountains, continuing to do these activities as a family so we wouldn't forget those things.
What do you think is the core issue here that allows something like this to happen?
Racism, because when our country was invaded, we were viewed as a dispensable population, and so it was easy to be able to do the level of damage that has occurred on tribal lands because the people are subhuman, viewed as subhuman, and have no rights and have no say in how we conduct our lives.
Back at UW, Zamanillo says fighting environmental racism means we all should think about the impacts of the products we buy and consume. But also, she says we must continually include impacted communities in the solutions.
It's not just about solving the problems, but also listening to these communities and collaborating.
Which is what is on Twala's mind.
What we see is decisions made on behalf of the community are at the root of some of the problems, because when you don't have the impacted community in the room at all levels, these are the people that we're going to have to live with this decision for our entire life.
Because they want to move past life as a uranium-impacted community. the impacts of environmental racism.
The land is beautiful, so wonderful. Yet, when you look underneath, it's a deadly, toxic slime that isn't going to go away, and it's stuck on our people.
Now, the Abrahamsons are calling for better health monitoring for the tribe to try and catch things earlier. We asked Newmont about health concerns, which said Newmont Don have no information that any tribal member's health has been impacted by the mine. All employees at the site participate in a comprehensive health and safety program to ensure safe working conditions are maintained and that no contamination leaves the site. Similarly, exposure levels are regularly monitored and reported to authorities.
I'm Mustafa Santiago Ali, and I work on environmental justice, climate, and community revitalization issues.
Dr. Ali has quite a resume. He spent more than 2 decades at the Environmental Protection Agency, where he helped found the Office for Environmental Justice. Now he is Vice President for Environmental Justice at the National Wildlife Federation. He spoke to Kristen Ayers about the connection between race and the environment.
What is environmental racism?
Environmental racism is the disproportionate impacts that continue to happen in communities of color, lower wealth white communities, and on Indigenous land. What it really means, it's the sacrifice zones where people place everything that nobody else wants. Coal-fired power plants, petrochemical facilities, waste incinerators, sewage treatment facilities, living in low-income housing with lead and other dangerous toxins. And they are the dumping grounds for, our most dangerous pollution, but also taking away people's ability to actually participate in the framing out of what their community should look like.
Why is it that we see certain communities where the kind of pollution that you just talked about is more rampant?
Systemic racism and how it is played out in policy. For years, folks saw Black and then brown communities as areas of least resistance. In our environmental laws, there have been these gaps that have allowed Black and brown and Indigenous communities to be the recipients of pollution that we would never allow in upper middle income or wealthy white communities. So it goes back to systemic racism, which is at its core, the thing that holds our country back. Whether we're talking about a policeman with their knee on someone's neck, or we're talking about the suffocation of folks from COVID-19, or the fact that many of our communities have been saying, I can't breathe, we can't breathe, in the context of the pollution that is so closely related to our communities, that is how systemic racism has played out, and in so many other ways.
How does it manifest on Indigenous land?
Well, Indigenous land has many of the similar problems depending on which part of the country that you're in. Sometimes they're dealing with the pollution that's coming out of power plants, coal-fired power plants or oil plants. They're also dealing with significant water quality issues. And we know that our Indigenous brothers and sisters are very tied to the land. It is a part of the culture.
What sorts of health outcomes do we see because of that?
We've got 100,000 people who are dying prematurely every year from air pollution in our country. That's more than are dying from gun violence, more than are dying from car crashes, and a number of other issues. And also, we have millions of people who are getting sick. They're getting sick. There are cancer clusters across our country because of the exposures that people are dealing with. Liver and kidney disease and lung diseases. And in this COVID-19 moment, when you have these chronic medical conditions, it makes you more vulnerable. Makes you more vulnerable to being infected, makes you more vulnerable to hospitalizations. And of course, we've seen, in so much reporting across our country, that when it comes to Black and brown communities, they're dying disproportionately from COVID-19. That's just one of the reasons that we have to be laser focused on the environmental injustices, the environmental racism that continues to plague our country.
What are some of the solutions to try and address these health issues, these pollution issues in these particular communities?
We have to reinvest in these communities, or begin to invest in some instances to make sure that they have a strong foundation underneath of them. We also have to minimize and eventually eliminate the pollution that is impacting these communities. We got to make sure that we're enforcing properly in these communities, because they're the places where the majority of businesses and industries that are contributing to the toxic loading that's impacting them are. You have to get educated, you have to get engaged, and you have to speak up and speak out.
As we learn more about historical racism and the racism we see now, you may have questions or you have a story that you want to share. We want to hear from you. Text the word story to 206-448-4545. Let's get back to what we talked about at the start of the show, the issue of land ownership. Today, those racist laws that prevented people from buying property are gone, but people of color today are still shortchanged. That's because their grandparents and their parents were not homeowners. It's called generational wealth. Right now, the gap between white and black homeownership nationally is wider than it was when race-based discrimination was legal. 71.9% of white people own homes. Compare that to 41.8% of blacks who are homeowners. That's a difference of just over 30%. It's even worse here in Western Washington. Today, 65.3% of white people in the Seattle area own homes, while only 28% of black people do, a difference of more than 37%. So what can we do to fix that, to close that gap, especially when buying a home in Western Washington is practically out of reach for so many people? Vanessa Mashanya looks at one solution.
Jimi Hendrix's guitar may have defined an era of American music, but it's the sound he forged right here, in the basements and the garages of the Central District, the section of Seattle south of downtown the black community has called home for 140 years.
Innovation, creativity, entrepreneurial spirit, all of that making a way out of no way is 100% part of the black experience, the African experience in America.
But those garages, those basements, all those spaces, they're being priced out. For decades, the Central District has been under attack by so-called economic development policies. Rising rents and rising house prices have been pushing black families and black businesses out, and that creates financial instability.
Anything needs space to exist. Our goal is to acquire, develop, maintain a space where our community can grow and thrive.
Kay Wyking Garrett is the president and CEO of Africatown Community Land Trust, a group dedicated to acquiring land in the Central District to expand access to prosperity for the black community.
Our brilliance can flourish and make the world a better place. The first thing was to stabilize, to stop pushing out of our community by creating access to affordable housing.
He, along with members Fanico Glover and Elijah L. Lewis, explained that being black and displaced in our region is nothing new. After the Great Depression, banks refused to give black families loans to buy homes in certain areas, keeping them segregated in the Central District. Racially restricted covenants found in the deeds from neighborhoods like Shoreline's Innis Arden back in 1940 prevented anyone but white people to live there unless they were a domestic servant.
There's a clear pattern of systemic practices between public sector, government policies, private sectors, banking, insurance industries that have systemically engineered black people, African Americans in this country into a second class.
A lot of our people have been moving further south, and now they have to make this commute to come here to Seattle just to work, and it's not equitable. We're going to continue to keep fighting and keep striving to bring equity to the Central District and Seattle.
Defund SPD! Defund SPD!
Looking back at the summer of protests, abolishing police brutality got most of the attention, but community leaders say the fight for land equity is an equally important part of ending structural racism.
It creates trauma in a people when what they're used to, their sense of place, is destroyed.
Former State Representative Don Mason stands in front of the former Branch Villa nursing home in the Central District. Once black-owned, now owned by the state. It's one of 4 properties in the Central District that organizations want the government to give back to the community. The hope is to turn them into community spaces for affordable housing, elder care, and youth achievement.
We have to be self-determined. Owning our own land allows us to be self-determined because we can make decisions we know that it'll be there 50 years from now, 100 years from now.
It's a process already underway with this building, former Fire Station 6. This summer, Seattle turned it over to the black community to become the William Gross Center for Enterprise. Like the basements Jimi Hendrix honed his skills in, it will be a center for young people to find and grow theirs.
To be empowered as people and have innovation hubs, that we are no longer looked as the inferior beings, and we are able to be the genius that we are, the leaders that we are, and be the creatives and not have any boxes put around us.
A former fire station is great, but activists say it is not enough. They are pushing the city for a $1 billion fund to buy more land in the Central District. Land the Black community, not outside interests, would develop.
The $1 billion acquisition fund, that's a lot of money. Is it enough? Why that big of a figure?
This inequity is very, very deep. And, I think this level of allocation to seed a fund to move things in another direction towards a new normal rooted in equity and away from the Jim Crow apartheid reality that we're in, that's a small investment. It's not a bank in the sense of holding monetary wealth, but it definitely is a vault in terms of storing value from our community.
You can see the vision of land equity already taking shape.
It's a connection to the past.
On the former site of the first Black-owned bank in the Pacific Northwest, the Liberty Bank building offers affordable living and business space in the heart of the Central District, allowing people the ability to stay in their neighborhood.
A lot of times people say that gentrification and displacement is just some type of natural phenomenon, right? But it's actually the result of choices. And the community here was able to come together to make sure that this particular project represents opportunity for the community that has been here, to be here and be part of the redevelopment.
Here, community wealth looks like this. A mother-son duo opening a new business.
My goal was to have something to pass down to my children. He took the vision and he's like, well, we could do this and we could do that.
Because of the available space in the building, Christy Brown and Damon Bomar are able to turn their catering business into a full-fledged restaurant.
What we want to be is a resource to other businesses, to help them understand how we got here and how they can get and do the things too.
It's coming full circle.
Down the street, Africatown Plaza, another building with affordable housing and space for businesses, is in the works.
We're really excited to continue the legacy that our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents established in this community. It should continue to be a part of this city's future.
Organizers like King say acquiring and creating space is not a luxury. It's a necessity to protect Black families, Black culture, and the growth of both. With new projects underway and the promise of additional land, community leaders have hope of creating a new future for Seattle with its roots deep in equity.
We know we have a lot more work to do, but you can see something moving forward in progress that helps to give our community back the confidence that we can regenerate, we can rebuild.
Now it's time for your frequently awkward questions, the part of our show where our experts answer your questions that you may be too afraid to ask.
Is there something wrong with saying, I don't see color? Answered by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, author of How to Be an Anti-Racist.
It is incredibly important for us to see difference, to see human beauty. If we don't see race, we're not going to see racial disparities. And if we don't see racial disparities, how can we see racist policies and eliminate them?
If you have a question for our experts and you want to see it on an upcoming episode of Facing Race, just text FAQ to 206-448-4545.
Next week on Facing Race, the plight of Pacific Northwest immigrants, from mental health issues to COVID-19.
Once you contract the disease, your risk of dying from it are much higher if you're Latino.
How the pandemic threatens to push those who are undocumented deeper into the shadows, and America's racial justice movement through the eyes of Washington's Black immigrants.
I did not learn racism until I came to the United States.
We want to thank you for being here tonight and for sharing your stories. To watch this or any episode of our show, you can find it online at king5.com/facingrace. We do hope to see you again next week, and from all of us here at King 5, good night.